get the creative sector to be part of that leadership? And how do we get the medical field and the rest of the economic field, as well as our political leaders, to understand what is the capacity, what is the potential and the impact of the arts? So just recently, there was an article that said that Canada pumps $1.4 billion into the arts and culture budget because our cultural industries represent a key sector of our economy, and their intersection of art, science, and technology offers infinite opportunities to innovate and problem solve. Investing in the Canadian cultural sector helps to create jobs, strengthen the economy, and ensures that the unique Canadian perspective is shared with the world. Canada understands that. Hopefully today, through our conversations, we will be able to figure out how Houston and our region can actually start leading in that conversation, and who our partners are, in order to make sure that they hear us and what is the language that we need to be working with them, so they understand our impact, they understand the potential, and they understand the power of the transformation that we have in this room, and in our theaters, and in our galleries, and in everywhere that we actually bring culture and art together, which of course is everywhere. And I think that today I am excited that you all are here to be part of this. It's not just about a singular vision, but it's how we actually challenge each other, how we challenge each other creatively, and how we challenge each other in terms of our conversation, so that we can be able to achieve something better in this city and make this city actually the leading arts culture that it needs to be. So thank you very much for being here. I hope that you enjoyed the day. And I'm going to turn this over to Christine Harris, who has been one of the leading lights of our creative economies. And we've understood the fact that she actually has been one of the instrumental people in understanding that how do we collect data, how do we look at ourselves as a sector in a very broad way, and not just about our nonprofit arts, not just about commercial, but really what are ways in which the economic industries can understand what is our power. So Christine wrote one of the initial papers on this and has been doing yeoman's work throughout the nation in order to expand and help the people understand what are our potentials and really work with all of our sectors in order to be able to lead us into the 21st century. Thank you all very much. Here's Christine Harris.
Thank you, Sixto. It's really great to be back in Houston. I had the pleasure of being here in November under the auspices of the Houston Arts Alliance, some great friends over the years. I'm going to start with a question, first of all. How many of you here consider yourself part of the nonprofit arts sector? Okay. How many of you consider yourselves part of the, what I'll call the for-profit creative sector, either as an independent artist or running a creative business, small for-profit creative business? Great, terrific. Well then, hopefully this will all make sense for everybody. So what is the creative economy and why does it matter? We need to pull up the PowerPoint. Do I just click? Will that bring it up? Where did Sixto go? We were going to do a poke push. Okay, we will move. Here we go. Okay, what is the creative economy and why does it matter? So, what's art? What's creative economy? The discussion of art and the creative economy can be pretty challenging. It's a relatively new conversation, which you'll see in a minute. What we've begun to realize, though, is that in addition to the aesthetic and the human and the spiritual connection that arts and culture brings to our lives, there has been and is an increasingly expanding impact of arts and culture in our economic communities and helping ensure that we have vibrant and dynamic communities. On the left, you'll see a picture of Portland. This is from Portland, Maine. It is oil refinery tanks, and they went through a process where they invited artists to come and paint these oil tanks. And it started out a little bit small. They had a couple of tanks. And then it expanded and expanded. And what it's done is it's become quite a tourism initiative. And it also has increased the pride in the community. And it's given artists a lot of work. On the right-hand side, you'll see the main hall of the new Santiago Calatrava edition of the Milwaukee Art Museum, which opened about 10 years ago. Not only has it significantly expanded tourism to the city, it's become the icon for the city of Milwaukee. It's really become the image by which everybody in Milwaukee tends to promote itself. But interestingly, it's done something else as well. It has raised the bar and the standard of architecture throughout the region. As people began to realize that they could aspire to something of this caliber in the community, architects were telling me that all of a sudden their clients, commercial and residential, wanted more and better designed architecture. So it's had this kind of massive, both psychological, aesthetic, and economic impact across the region of Milwaukee. So where did all of this come from? Well, on the lower left-hand side, you'll see Mount Auburn is an economic development agency, and in 2001, they did the first creative economy study here in the country. The states of New England, 6 states, the New England Council, said that, you know, we know that culture has a significant impact on what's happening in our economy here. They looked whether it was the crafts in Vermont and New Hampshire, whether it was Tanglewood in western Massachusetts. They recognized that there was a very significant impact, but they never measured it. And they said to themselves, being a chamber of commerce, they said, I wonder if we look at this the same way we look at our other industry clusters, whether it's manufacturing or retail or finance. I wonder what we would find out. So Mount Auburn constructed a way of looking at the creative assets in a community, its nonprofit assets, its for-profit creative assets, its independent artists. If we put an umbrella around all of that, over all of that, and we look at it in the same way we look at economic contribution in any other industry cluster, what will we find out? As a result, they did the first economic study. They've now done many, many around the country. So that started in about 2001. In 2002, Richard Florida published The Rise of the Creative Class. How many are you familiar with Richard Florida's work? Yeah, he's been around for a while. He was the first one to basically raise nationally the conversation about what happens if you look at people whose primary jobs have some sort of creative content to them. Now, he happened to look at it in a way that included healthcare, law, intellectual property, business, educators, and so he comprised about 30% of the US workforce. And a lot of communities look at it that way. A lot of communities think that that's a little bit broad. It's a very wide proportion of the population. So in some cases, it's become a little bit unworkable from a measurement perspective, but really raised the bar in terms of communication. And then finally, over on the right-hand side, you'll see a relatively new development called creative placemaking. Art Place America started in 2010. The National Endowment for the Arts started about that time funding creative placemaking, looking at those activities that actually bring arts and culture and creative businesses together with cultural and community development. In fact, the Houston Arts Alliance in 2013 received an Our Town grant for a 3-month celebration for Houston's East End. So this has been a burgeoning area of development, and a lot of foundations have gotten more involved in funding it. So beginning to tweak at the edges of this merger of our economy and looking economically, as well as the human, spiritual, and neighborhood impact of the arts. This is not a United States phenomenon. In fact, we're very late to the table. We're about a decade behind where Europe and Australasia has been. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has been measuring the creative economy since 2002. They published a report in 2008, 2010, and 2013. Their latest one, as you can see, shows over $600 billion in 2011. It's doubled since 2002, pretty significant annual growth rate of 9%, and they consider this to be one of the most dynamic sectors of the world economy. The European Union and the UK all have creative economy strategies at the government level, very involved at the policy, cultural government policy level, as does Australasia. So we actually are late to this particular game. So what does it mean, the creative economy? Let's look a little bit at language. The creative economy is really a new industry cluster. It's not a nationally recognized by the government industry cluster yet. It's been an amalgam of different kinds of businesses based on those businesses and people who produce intellectually protected goods and services that generated from aesthetic or cultural content. It isn't that every business doesn't have creativity, that every one of us doesn't employ our own creative skills. It's about the production of goods and services that have economic value using that creativity that defines this particular cluster. And the cluster is made up of creative enterprises. Those businesses, all of you who raised your hands in this room represent one of those business enterprises. You and your workers in your business make up the creative economy in that kind of creative business. And also looking at creative occupations. The workers whose jobs produce or distribute creative goods and services in any type of business. If you're a product designer in a manufacturer, if you're an architect that you work for a contractor, you have a creative occupation, you work in a business that if for these purposes we're not calling a creative industry, but you have a creative occupation. And the combination of these creative enterprises and occupations make up what we're calling a creative economy. So why define and measure this as an industry cluster? Why even put all of this together? Well, we believe in the continuum of imagination, conceiving of what is not, and then moving into creativity, applying that imagination, and then eventually evolving that in innovation, what becomes unique or novel creativity, bringing forth something entirely new. And so the goal is to understand the context of these industries in the communities that make choices to what they invest in. Communities all have to make choices. Where do we invest our resources? What assets do we leverage? This is all about, take a look at the creative assets. We bear witness to the opportunity to expand the economic and neighborhood development potential of any community. So it begins to recognize the economic value of those assets. It begins to look across business sectors. The nonprofit, across business models, I should say, the nonprofit businesses and the for-profit businesses don't often always work together, connect together, look at ways in which they can partner, collaborate. What assets do we have that we might be able to combine and move forward with, and how together do we actually offer something to the community based on our creative capital, our creative assets, not necessarily just our business model. It also helps us to move beyond this nice to have, quality of life, into a point of differentiation, both in consumers and businesses and also as communities. People can live anywhere. Why do they choose to live in Houston or choose to live someplace else? What's that differentiation of place that makes something unique and someplace people want to live in? And also it's about talent. It's about attraction and retention of talent is the #1 issue facing most of our communities these days and our companies. What role does the creative economy play in not only fostering that talent, but also attracting talent here, whether they're in the creative industries or not? So the way we're defining creative economy for the purposes of this work here and the work that Houston Arts Alliance has done here is it's that economic sector that employs culture and creativity to generate wealth and jobs through ideas, products, and services. And as I mentioned, it's those organizations and individuals whose products originate in that content, and it includes this umbrella of arts and culture organizations, independent creatives, and for-profit creative businesses. The way we, just a little bit of technicality here on the way we measure the creative economy, if you've had a chance to take, I know it was handed out today when you registered, Houston's Creative Economy Study measured the creative economy. I want to point out the way in which we come about this because it's important for future development. Most people take a look at it in terms of the government database of what we call NAICS codes or how we classify industries. This is a way every business is classified. Whether or not you put a NAICS code on your tax, your tax information, somebody reading that is going to give your business a NAICS code. And there's a code for every business that files a tax. In the same way, a company files what kind of occupations do you have? And so if you have a bunch of product designers, you say that part of who we employ are product designers or marketing directors or engineers or whatever have you. So the government keeps track of all of this for every industry. And so we use this system. We also, there's more work being done with part of the data system from the Department of Labor called ONET, which looks at every single occupation in the country and what kind of skills are needed for each of those occupations. So you can actually take a look at what proportion of creativity is needed in all sorts of different kinds of occupations. That's a newly evolving nomenclature for looking at the creative economy. The government database has its pros and cons. The pros are it's trackable, it happens every year, it is comparable to other communities, and you can benchmark yourself year after year after year, which is what I'll show you a little bit about what Houston Arts Alliance did with their work. The disadvantages are it misses a lot of new businesses. If you're a new creative business starting up with a new software app, it's unlikely to catch you until a little bit further down the road. The time frame doesn't keep up with some of the new things happening in our economy because it's always a year or so behind, and the codes don't change often enough to keep track of what's actually happening in our community. But it's the best we have. So what do creative businesses look like? This is just an example of the way we actually categorize creative businesses. So on the right-hand side, you can see these are the actual descriptions of different kinds of business enterprises that come out of the NAICS codes. And on the left-hand side, you can see how we've segmented them into different kinds of creative segments. It's a way to give you an example of the kind of businesses that are included in this information. And you'll see, for example, under performing arts, theater companies, whether they're nonprofit or Broadway companies. It includes dance companies, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. It includes musical instrument manufacturing, supply stores. So you can see it doesn't care what the business model is, it just cares what you do as a business. So it merges all of that into all of these different segments, and we can measure how many of these specific businesses that you see on the right-hand side exist in Houston or any other community. We can do the same for occupations. Again, the right-hand side, these are actual descriptions coming from the occupation codes, and then we've kind of merged them into different kinds of creative segments. And again, we can measure these in any locale, anywhere in the country over the course of time. Interestingly, it's important to point out that every creative economy is local. Your creative economy in Houston is different than the creative economy in Milwaukee or Louisiana or anywhere else in the country. For example, fashion was very important to count for Houston's creative economy. It's non-existent in Milwaukee. In Louisiana, culinary, very important to count, as in DC as well. So it's an important part of that. So every community has this kind of standard codes that we've just looked at here, but then expanding it to make sure that it includes those particular pieces of creative business that is relevant to a particular locale. So Houston has a creative economy that is its own and represents itself to the rest of the country. So how do you put all this together? How we put it all together is here's how we merge the workers in the creative enterprises and workers in creative occupations in other industries. You'll see in the left-hand circle that this represents the workers in creative enterprises. So in your businesses, as creative businesses, if you look in the middle there, creative workers in a creative business. If you're an actor in a theater company, if you're a graphic designer in an ad agency, you're a creative worker in a creative enterprise. On the left-hand side, you'll see what are those other workers in that creative enterprise that make sure that that creative enterprise works. Are you a receptionist in an architecture firm, an accountant in an orchestra? As a former administrator of an arts organization, I don't know whether I'd fit in that other or that creative, but it looks at every single worker in that creative business as a job in the creative enterprise. On the right-hand side, you'll see if you have a creative occupation, wherever that creative occupation happens to be. You'll see it shares that middle circle, creative workers and creative enterprises. You'll see that that shares that circle there. So if you're a graphic designer in an ad agency, but it also has this other category, creative workers in other enterprises. I'm a product designer in a manufacturer. I'm an architect, but I work for a contractor. I'm a graphic designer, but I work in a bank. Those industries aren't creative industries, but I have a creative occupation that I hold in that industry. Therefore, I'm a member of the creative economy, and what we do is we add all of those up together, and it ends up defining a locale's creative economy. So let's look at Houston. Houston did this analysis in 2011 and 2014, and you'll see that The Houston Arts Alliance is the one taking the lead in defining and measuring and integrating the creative economy, and they've been part of the national conversation. Jonathan Gluss is a colleague of mine in the National Creative Economy Coalition. Houston's voice has been very important in the national conversation and has taken a lead in looking at the creative economy in a large metropolitan area. So you'll see quite a healthy increase, 22% increase. In numbers of jobs in Houston's creative economy between 2014 and 2011, over 179,000 jobs. I want to point out a couple of things. So first of all, it means Houston's creative economy is growing. Terrific. It's interesting looking at, if you look on the right-hand side, an 18% growth rate in creative workers and other enterprises. This is actually mirroring a national trend, which is looking at businesses, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're finance institutions, whether they're retailers, whether they're wholesalers. They're looking to make sure that their capacity to be creative is in-house. So instead of always contracting out that graphic designer or contracting out that marketing director or contracting out their own their ad agencies, they're bringing a lot more of that in-house because it becomes a differentiator. It becomes something that they can be competitive with. So that means that what's happening here in Houston is more creative occupation investment in non-creative businesses. Where are they? You can learn a lot about where they are, why is it happening, how can they make sure that Houston is feeding the creative needs of those creative occupations. Often, for example, when we did this in Milwaukee, the head of one of our local banks had just hired a new marketing director. And they said to me, you know, we think this person is terrific, but, you know, they're sitting in a bank office. And if I don't find a way to feed their creativity, then I'm afraid they're not going to stay here. So the opportunity to create networking between creative workers in non-creative businesses and businesses like yourselves and creative workers in creative businesses will provide opportunity to grow and learn and feed into the entire creative capital of a community. The other interesting thing is that 31% increase in other workers in creative enterprises. This seems to be indicating, and only diving into the statistics would tell us more, but it seems to be indicating that creative businesses in Houston are growing so that they need creative work. And it's no slouch that 15% increase in creative workers in creative businesses is a strong, strong growth. So some good numbers. Now is an opportunity to really take advantage of that and make sure you don't lose it. So why communities research their creative economy? Houston was part of the first national research we did in 2010 to try and look at how are people defining the creative economy around the country. We looked at 27 locales, and you'll see these are the reasons why they said they wanted to support it. They recognize that creative talent is a pretty hot commodity. Growing it locally, developing it locally is pretty important leverage for a vibrant economy. Most new and emerging small businesses can live and work anywhere, so why make a choice in a particular community? And that depends on how well they're fostered and how well they're supported in growing their businesses and growing their own talent as well. It also helps to compare the economic value of the creative industries to what's happening in other industry clusters. What's happening in, it's an interesting economy in Houston, you know, a lot of dependency on the energy and defense industries. What's happening there? What's happening in other industries that feed into those? And where does the creative industries fit in that? So you can be at the table because you've measured the creative economy in the same way that other industry clusters are measuring themselves. So it enables the community to take a look at the broader picture. So one of the whole points of this is to make sure that the community, the creative community, sits at the table with an equal seat. It often leads to very interesting policy decisions. The state of Colorado did this analysis in 2008, and it took its state arts board, renamed it the Office of Creative Industries, connected it to the Small Business Administration. It's now totally integrated with the Economic Development Agency of the state of Colorado so that the whole state of Colorado has a creative industry strategy. Interesting story about Louisiana. When Louisiana first did a statewide creative economy analysis, what they did in 2005, Mount Auburn did that, the report came out a month before Katrina. And when the report came out, it came out as the second largest industry cluster in the state of Louisiana, second to healthcare. And the governor said, whoa, we better make sure we're really supporting the assets here, that they've got access to all the same resources and support services that the government offers. So they made sure that they had access to small business development loans, other resources that the state had to offer. So Katrina hits. They make $160 million available for the rebuilding of the South Coast, primarily New Orleans, and because the creative industries were built into their infrastructure at the state level, a lot of those for-profit and nonprofit creative businesses got access to that money. So when you think back to the resurgence of New Orleans, a lot of the music clubs, a lot of the restaurants, came back fairly quickly, and they had access to the same amount of money any other business had access to. That's the power of looking at the creative industry from a policy perspective. Michigan is just at the revitalizing of the economy, particularly in Detroit, with looking at the creative assets and the role of design in particular in the state of Michigan. So the creative industries has what I like to think of as a triple net impact on a community. Not only do you have the value and the increased role of the contribution of jobs and wages and businesses in the creative industries, but then it has a positive business impact. It actually helps other businesses be more creative and take advantage of those creative activities. It also fosters significant tourism and helps foster more artistic employment. And then finally, creatives beget creatives. People want to live in a creative community. I don't care what you do, where you work, you want to live in a community that's cool and creative and has got stuff going on. So it improves the regional attractiveness of any community. And that then feeds into bringing more creative industries in and more creative community growth. The development of looking at our creative assets this way has spawned some other interesting information. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, is the organization that you hear about every quarter when they talk about our GDP growth. And they spin off different kinds of industry clusters to take a look at what, in fact, is happening in specific areas. So they spun off a couple years ago, along with the National Endowment for the Arts, their initiative spun off an arts and culture satellite account. And as a result, has shown that 4.3% of the contribution of the GDP in 2012 comes from arts and culture. Now we've got something, and that was a 5% increase on the year before. So now we have something that actually measures what's happening to arts and culture and the growth in our GDP. Americans for the Arts continues to look at arts-related businesses, nonprofit and for-profit, and they've seen that it represents 4% of all the businesses and close to 2% of all the workers in America. And now creativity is being included as a core competency skill in the American workforce. So what's beginning to happen is the conversation is changing across other agencies nationally by this focus and work on creative economy across a lot of our communities. And some other developments that are current, this U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis is now looking at local and regional GDP, and they're actually experimenting, looking to see what would happen if we pull out these numbers for local and regional. How does that affect local GDP growth? The National Endowment for the Arts has a program called Creativity Connects going on right now, where they're looking at researching what is the arts contribution to our entire creative ecosystem. And in June of this year, they'll be publishing the first of their reports on the infrastructure, where the arts fit in the infrastructure. There'll be a Creative World Summit in DC in July. The Creative Economy Coalition I mentioned that Jonathan and I are part of this, along with the National Creativity Network, and it will host the first World Summit on creative economy and creative industries. As I said, we're behind others, so there'll be strong representation from South America as well as the UK and Australasia. What are the implications for our creative sector by even looking at things this way? Why do it? What are the implications? Well, it becomes a different conversation. No one owns creativity. It's been a little bit of this conversation, maybe not in Houston, but in Milwaukee when we first did it. I can tell you that it's been a little challenging for the nonprofits. I spent 30 years running nonprofit arts organizations, and we tend to think of ourselves as, well, we're the creative ones in town, and we're the ones offering all the best of our creative expression. But in fact, it challenges that concept, and it provides a broader conversation on what is creativity. And if we strip away what our business models are, how are we deploying our assets? How are we leveraging our assets? How are we connecting and collaborating on our assets? And so if we can pull ourselves away from being competitive and look at how we can actually come together and be collaborative as a creative sector, we're going to find that things actually expand and explore, as some of the examples I've shown you with Colorado and Louisiana and some others. Also, we tend to look at, particularly in the arts, we tend to look at economic impact. If you buy a ticket to the arts, maybe you've had to hire a babysitter, maybe you've had to park your car, maybe you've gone out to dinner. What's the economic impact? This takes it from economic impact into economic value, because that's how other industry clusters are measured at your city and your metro area. So it's not just looking at impact, it's actually looking at jobs and wages and the values of those wages and the numbers of those jobs and the number of business establishments. Are they increasing or aren't they increasing? So that it takes it into the realm of any other industry analysis. And it gives us an opportunity to rethink our creative assets. What if our theater companies and our symphony orchestras and our dance companies and all of our nonprofit arts began to think of ourselves not as one organization, but every musician is its own creative person, their own creative asset? What if every dancer, and what if we really looked at combining all of that? What would we be able to do in terms of really leveraging that creativity across our community? So what are the implications for the community as you look at the creative sector? Well, there's increased global competition for talent. And as I said, people want to live in fun, creative places. So it helps build that attraction to come to Houston, because you're building that creative economy and that talent base here. So that's important. So talent can and will live and work anywhere. So why Houston? So and then also it looks at, there's a real bottom line economic impact of a strong creative economy, and because we're beginning to look at the numbers. So finally, in looking at how we transform cities through a creative economy, first of all, it helps to foster entrepreneurial creative businesses. More businesses develop. Hopefully there's more loan opportunities, more opportunity to really foster those young creative businesses, to keep those businesses here, to track those businesses here. You have a lot of graduates that are graduating from higher education here. Do you want to keep some of them here? How do you keep them here? Some of you are presumably products of the education system here, or are working with the education system here. We're sitting at the University of Houston, 40-some thousand people, a new college of arts. How do we make sure that that whole community of Houston fosters that environment, not only with their work experience while they're here, but hopefully keep some of them here? The talent attraction piece, the neighborhood development, making sure that creativity and artists and development are totally embedded in the social fabric of our neighborhoods. It's interesting, one of the factoids that came out of Houston's recent study, and I picked it up when Jonathan did a Facebook posting on this, that the study showed that 41% of creative goods and services, if I got the number right, are locally supplied here. That means 59% are being imported. Well, why? So what you've got is an opportunity to keep and attract and keep talent here and grow that talent. And how do you create more awareness of that creative talent that's here? And some people will think, well, then we're not importing anything, we're just moving it around the community. But that's really not very true, because creative businesses can have clients anywhere in the world. They can live and work anywhere technologically, they can have clients anywhere in the world. So in fact, what happens is if you expand the local capacity to provide creative goods and services, you'll expand the exporting of creative goods and services, because those local companies will grow business, those architects, those graphic designers, those software developers will have clients all over the world, and they'll start bringing in new business into the Houston economy. So there's an opportunity here to really, really more significantly grow the creative talent and the creative economy here in Houston by growing and expanding so that those local resourced goods and services actually increase. And also collaborative working spaces, that people wanting to connect with each other, learn from each other. Some companies are even creating their R&D departments in separate places and creating co-working spaces to get out of that environment, to be in a more creative, informal environment, to learn from and network with each other. And provide ultimately more business competitiveness. And then quality of place improves. So you increase the heart and soul of a community, the distinction of a community, and you begin to really impact on what makes Houston a vibrant, dynamic place to live. So questions Houston, I think, has an opportunity to ask itself. The final slide. Do we believe that creativity is a key differentiator for talent attraction, business development, community engagement? If we do, where does the creative ecosystem fit within overall metro development planning? Is it off on its own, doing its own thing, or are you really integrating it into the metro economic and development planning for the future of the Houston region? And if you do believe that creativity is a key differentiator, who's going to take the lead in facilitating a strategic plan that helps really foster the creative community, leverages those assets, builds the creative capital, whether that's in businesses, whether that's K-16 education, neighborhood development, et cetera? Where do you go from here? And finally, and maybe most importantly, is there a collective will to maximize Houston's creative capital? Are people willing to eliminate the barriers and the fences around their own businesses to connect with other people, forget what your business models are, and come together as a creative community to help evolve yourself into a resilient new economy city that really keeps Houston moving on the map from a creative perspective. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the creative economy here. My buddy Jonathan.
Do you want to sit down or stay right here? You want to sit down?
Well, as usual, that was a great conversation, Christine. I want to brag on Christine for just a second. She really has been, Sixto spoke about this for a minute, she really has been at the forefront of creative economy work for many, many years in this country. And if you have not visited Milwaukee in the last few years, it physically embodies the type of work that she has done. It has really evolved away from being a full-on 20th century industrial town to a really beautiful new economy city. And it was to a great extent because this lady was brilliant at bringing the right business leaders and the right community leaders and the right creatives into the room together. So thank you for what you've done in that city and how you're helping the rest of us across the country to move into this area. But I have a couple questions for you based on your comments. One is, early on anyway, in a lot of American cities, and actually I would argue Latin and European cities as well, the real fulcrum when they started focusing on creative economy is when their traditional economies started going down and they had to rethink their city. We're not in that situation here. We're about expanding our economy, but we have an incredibly vibrant economy. How is the language, how do you suggest the language has to be different to make the argument here than in a city like that?
Good question. I think what's changed over the years, even when creative economy work started in 2001, 2002, or even with Richard Florida's publishing the book, is that the mobility of the changing nature of our workforce, the mobility of workers, particularly millennial workers, to live someplace before they figure out what they rather choose where they live first before where they work. I think that began to spearhead it about, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think what's propelling it forward now is the demand for and the pressure and the global competition for talent, for creative talent, and creativity in any sphere of our work. And so I think the reality is it's going to continue to be pressure on creativity, and I think the creative industries, frankly, have yet to even really demonstrate in a community the value and role of creativity. For example, I think there's some communities do this and some don't. I tried it in Milwaukee and we just couldn't make any headway in it. That all of you work with the creative process. You're creative thinkers, you're creative workers. There's a role to play in understanding how that creative process can work across any kind of company. I don't care whether you're in a cubicle at, in our case, Northwestern Mutual Insurance Company. That ability to cross-fertilize creativity in the creative process, I think there's a role to play for creatives making that connection, and I think that's a new frontier that hasn't happened yet. But the pressure point is going to remain creative talent, and talent that can think differently and be innovation. There was some interesting research lately on even people tend to think, well, I'm in a white-collar job, you know, that'll always be creative. It won't be the same pressure to outsource blue-collar. But the reality is there's more and more automation and digitization happening in white-collar businesses. So that differentiation is only going to come from a new way, new creative thinking, new innovation. And so I think that will be the continuing pressure. It's a very different kind of pressure, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
That's interesting. What do you feel about the need for startup capital?
I think it's my experience looking around the country and also in my home of Milwaukee. It's very difficult to get startup capital at the very gestation of something versus, okay, now we can show that we can get $1 million to put something into. So I think creative capital startup is very important. I think